Thank you so much. Forgive me for being urgent here, but we have these two very important senators only for a brief period. And because it is such a brief period, I'm going to be very brief. My name is John Hamry. I'm the president here at CSIS, but my role here is ornamental. But I do want to say a sincere thank you to Senator Graham and to Senator Blumenthal. These are there are two leaders that have been pushing an extraordinarily important thing, and that is we have to find a way to end this hideous war. And they know what the real leverage is, and they've been consistently talking about it. And I feel like we're getting closer, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that. Both of them share a background in that they're both lawyers, and they are both military men. Senator Blumenthal was a sergeant in the Marine Corps Reserve. Senator Graham was, I think, a colonel in the Air Force Reserve, the JAG officer. But what they're doing here combines both of this. It's the legal expertise they bring and their passion for national security. They know what's at stake, and I'm so very grateful that they're leading on this. And Clay Siegel is going to moderate this discussion. He's the Schlesinger Chair in Energy and Geopolitics here at CSIS, has a long background in energy economics, intelligence analysis, and risk analysis. So, Clay, let me turn to you and let's get going. Would you please, with your applause, say thank you to these senators?
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Hamry. And thank you, senators, for being here with us. Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal, we're going to be discussing energy leverage in the Russia-Ukraine war. And as Dr. Hamry said, I look after energy security here at the center. So I am like a kid in a candy shop with these senators today talking about this issue. Let's dive right in and explore our topic in detail. Senator Graham, President Trump has already tried quite a few of the tools in the toolkit to get Putin to compromise on Ukraine. We've seen incentives like the recent summit in Alaska. We've seen punishments like sanctions, tariffs, related measures. How do you hope to use legislation to persuade Moscow to end this war?
Well, to give President Trump a tool that would make every customer of Russia think twice about continuing supporting Russia by buying their cheap oil to prop up Putin's war machine. Now, why does this matter to us as a nation? In the 90s, the Ukrainians had 1,700 nuclear weapons. They gave those weapons back to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union with a promise that their sovereignty would be respected. If Putin gets away with this, who would do that in the future? And if you think Putin's going to stop in Ukraine, you're not listening to what he says. So my belief is, let's stop it now in Ukraine. Putin's the bad guy. Ukraine's the good guy, but not the perfect guy. It is in our interest to end this war sooner rather than later to keep it from spreading. And if we don't end it right, there goes Taiwan. When Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, I think it sent a ripple effect throughout the world that wasn't good. If we end this war in a way that Putin's perceived to have won through aggression, that will be worse than Afghanistan. So this bill allows President Trump to impose sanctions and secondary tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil and gas and energy writ large that don't help Ukraine. How do you get him to the table? You break his ability to wage war. Oil is down to $36 a barrel, I think, in Russia. He can't do this much longer. The Russian economy is unraveling. When President Trump sanctioned the two largest Russian oil companies, it really mattered. Our bill would give him a tremendous club to use to get Putin to the table. It would put everybody on notice that you buy Russian oil cheap at your own peril. And finally, when he put a 25% tariff on India for buying Russian oil, it really mattered. Before the invasion, India was buying 3% of their oil from Russia. It got to be dirt cheap. They went up to almost 30%. since Trump imposed the tariffs, which is the theory of our bill, India is now going back down, not up. So this bill needs to be passed. It needs to be passed soon to give President Trump some leverage as we try to negotiate yet again.
Thank you, sir. Senator Blumenthal, the bill that you and Senator Graham have prepared, called the Sanctioning Russia Act, has attracted 85 Senate co-sponsors. I think it's safe to say that that's one of the most widely supported bills on the Hill at a time of, let's face it, there is some divisiveness in Washington these days. What explains the extraordinary bipartisan consensus that you guys have managed to pull together here?
Divisiveness? You say there's divisiveness in Washington?
There's no gambling going on.
Senator Graham's extraordinary persuasive power, I think, is the major factor here. But very seriously, we have established a real partnership on this bill. There's a trust and a cooperative approach here that I think is very unusual, even in the best of times in Washington. And our staffs who are represented here today also have worked closely together. So I think it's a tribute to Senator Graham and to our partnership that we've attracted this many. But let me just come right to the real point here. The American people support Ukraine. I will tell you, in Connecticut and in my travels around the country, essentially the American people are moved and inspired by this country that is fighting for its life. And Senator Graham and I, I think it was our first trip, when our embassy had closed down, there were no American diplomats or troops there. We went into Ukraine and we went to Bucha, where the Russian tanks were stopped. That's about a 5-minute drive from Zelensky's bunker. That's how close they came. Bucha is also the place where Ukrainian women and children were shot in the back of the head and buried in mass graves. This kind of brutality, atrocity, slaughter has repulsed the American people, and the heroism of the people of Ukraine has inspired them. So I think you begin with popular support for this cause. Second, I think we recognize that there should be bipartisan support for a strategy that stops Putin before he goes against Poland or the Baltic states. If we don't stop Putin now, what is the lesson of history? Appeasement never works. Appeasement is a failed strategy. I've called the present danger of failure to act more aggressively a possible Munich in slow motion. We need to be strong on the Russian sanctions bill. We also need to provide the Tomahawks, more ATACMs, more F-16s. Military aid is absolutely essential. But as Senator Graham has said so well, in effect, stopping or even strangling the war machine is one of the most salient ways to persuade Putin that peace through strength is our strategy, and that strategy works. And I'll just say finally, and we've talked about it, Ukraine has to address the corruption problem, another aspect of energy here, because corruption in the energy sector has to be stopped. In the meantime, Russia is waging a campaign of aerial terror against Ukraine's civilian population, against its homes, hospitals, schools, and yes, all of its energy grid. And I think the American people get it, that this is going to be an absolutely barbarian kind of winter for the Ukrainians, because a lot of their sources of supply, whether it's for gas or electricity, has been decimated. Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear plant, is at risk. And so I think energy is a key sector that has to be addressed.
Thank you, sir. Senator Graham, as you know, there are powerful economic forces that are related to Russian energy. Two of the world's largest economies, China and India, are the main buyers of Russian oil. How can we steer them away from those steep discounts that you referenced a minute ago and get their cooperation to help end the war?
make it more costly to buy cheap Russian oil than it is today. They're doing it because it's cheap. India went from 3% before the invasion of Russian oil to almost 30%. And they're saying, why don't I buy this cheap oil? Well, you're propping up Putin's war machine, who's dismembering Ukraine. So to our friends in India, thank you for trying to reverse course. You're doing the right thing. The money you're saving on oil is going to be lost and then some by the 25% tariff to China. I really believe if Xi picked up the phone tomorrow and told Putin, you're now hurting me, a lot of this war would end pretty quickly. So China is very mercantile. They're going to keep doing what they're doing until it costs too much. I think President Trump realizes that. That's why he's called for the passage of the bill. I don't know what this 28-point plan is. I'm glad that we're coming up with a plan, but no plan will work unless Putin and his allies believe that we're serious about more military aid, more capability of Ukraine to hurt Russia militarily, and more economic ruin coming to those who prop up Putin's war machine. When they believe those two things, then the 28-point plan will work. If they don't believe those things, a 50-point plan won't work. So this is very simple to me. Russia's incredibly exposed because most of their money to prosecute the war comes from the energy sector. They're incredibly exposed, and we need to hit them where it hurts. And finally, about Senator Blumenthal, we've been there 5, 6, 7 times. We've been working on peace in the Mideast. He went with me. I went with him when Biden was in charge to try to get normalization. He's going with me now that Trump's in charge. All I can say about Senator Blumenthal, he sees the world for what it is, and his lending his name and his prestige to this effort has gotten us to 85. And today, we're on the threshold of passing this bill. President Trump said over the weekend, send me the bill. So we need to send him the bill to help end this war.
Thank you, sir. Senator Blumenthal, maybe let's discuss the domestic economic implications. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, crude prices spiked, gasoline prices spiked, over fears that Russian supply would be removed from the global market. Not good for business, not good for consumers. So how should we balance the desire and the need to end the war with our requirements for energy affordability and the fight against inflation?
Well, first of all, let me just say both Senator Graham and I are graduates of the John McCain School on foreign relations, but certainly Russian relations. And John McCain famously referred to Russia as a gasoline station with nuclear arms. And it is totally dependent on the sales of oil and gas for its economy. We are not. And the price of some of these commodities could rise. They do. It's dependent somewhat on OPEC. Right now we're meeting with, or I shouldn't say we, but the president has been meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who has a lot to say about what the production in OPEC is. There are ways to compensate for the potential reduction in oil and gas, and Putin has to sell it somewhere. He's going to sell it at a lower price, not a higher price, if China and India and Brazil and Hungary are not buying his oil and gas. So I think whatever the cost, number one, it can be minimized. Number two, it's worth it. You know, we are a great country and a great economy, and we can absorb that minimal additional cost in crude, and potentially it can help to generate interest in other sources of energy, whether it's solar, wind, I know the president doesn't think highly of those necessarily, but the point is it's a minimal cost for what we can accomplish here. Ending the war, as John said at the very beginning, ending this insidious war that is so decimating the population of both Russia and Ukraine. And it is, you know, it is an inhumane war filled with criminality on the part of Putin, stealing, abducting, kidnapping children. We have a bill that would declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism if it doesn't return those children. Now, you know, we're not here to talk about atrocities of that kind, but it is connected to the energy sector insofar as we may have to pay some price economically to save children and to achieve peace there.
If I may, about the domestic implications, the critical minerals deal is a very big deal. You know, our dependency on China in the critical mineral space, we need to get off that. We need to be independent of that. And we're moving in the right direction. President Trump's doing deals in critical minerals area all over the world. But the deal with Ukraine is monumental. They're sitting on the top of the largest deposits of critical minerals in Europe. And having a deal between the United States and Ukraine, we'll get our money back from the war and then some, but it creates an economic interest to defend. If you're going to do a deal with a country and the neighboring country is trying to invade and undercut the value of that deal, then you have an interest to defend. And I think what President Trump did in signing this deal, it changed the image of the war among Republicans. It's been popular among Democrats, and it is actually growing in popularity supporting Ukraine because we're making a case that Ukraine benefits America. Ukraine stability is good for the American economy, and Ukraine brings to the table critical minerals up to $1 trillion or more. And I hope America appreciates that this deal, once the war is over, will help us, will over time make it easier to sell what we're doing.
This is really a critical point, if I can just make a comment. I will never forget in our meeting with President Zelensky, when Senator Graham first suggested the idea of this minerals deal. I'm not sure he first got it until a translator told him what we were talking about, and his eyes lit up. And this, I have to give credit where it's due. Senator Graham has been pushing the minerals deal from the very outset. I think it may have been his idea. But the reason why it's significant is not only that we need these rare earth minerals for our economy, but it is also a guarantee of Ukrainian security. Yes. The end of this war will come only when Ukraine's long-term security is guaranteed. Now, you know, I'd love to see Ukraine as a member of NATO. It ain't going to happen overnight. But a guarantee of its security by the United States is absolutely essential, because what have we learned again from history? Putin and Russia will invade again. We'll have a pause in the war unless Ukraine's security is guaranteed. And the mineral deal gives us an economic stake. It means that American companies are going to be over there with their workers. And if Putin or his successor attacks again, and they start messing around with missiles and drones, attacking civilian targets, our civilians are going to be killed. And we're going to be in that war. So the kind of security that this mineral deal assures, I think, is really very important.
Thank you, Senator. Sticking with the geopolitical dimension, you had mentioned some of the diplomacy taking place in town this week. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is visiting the United States as a key ally, and one that cooperates with Russia through the group of oil-producing countries called OPEC+. Senator Graham, what role would you like to see our allies play in helping to amplify the pressure on Putin?
Well, anything that our allies could do to get Putin to the peace table would be great. And I think he only will go there when the military costs get greater and when the economic costs get greater and no end in sight. So all the oil producing countries can help here. But Saudi Arabia, I think Dick and I went 7 or 8 times to Riyadh and Jerusalem when President Biden was president. We were trying to get Saudi Arabia to expand the Abraham Accords, to recognize Israel, which would be the effective end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the biggest change in the Mideast in about 2,000 years. Now, the Khashoggi episode is real, and is part of history here. But what MBS has done is real too, the reforms on the ground. But to have the leader of the center of Islam, the Holy Mosque in Mecca, Medina, say publicly with the President of the United States yesterday, under the right conditions, I am willing to join the Abraham Accords, is earth-shattering. As to Senator Blumenthal, we have done this together from day one. I was the Republican, he was the Democrat. And what does MBS want? To recognize Israel. A defense agreement with the United States. A pathway to a Palestinian state, and economic integration with us in the energy sector and beyond. He mentioned those things yesterday. October the 7th was designed to stop what we were working on. We were going to announce at the end of October that year a framework for the deal. Then comes October the 7th. Iran saw this as an existential threat to their control of the region. So both of us are dedicated to getting this thing through. So now what do we have to do? Whatever we do with the Palestinian state, enclave, emirate, whatever you want to call it, has to be sold to Israel as an antidote to terrorism, not a reward for terrorism. If there's ever to be a self-governing Palestine, it's got to be done in a way that Israel believes is an antidote to future terrorism, that you're replacing the bad actors with people that can live in peace with Israel. In terms of Israel, if you want to end the Arab-Israeli conflict, you got to give MBS something on the Palestinian issue to sell to the Arab world who's been watching Al Jazeera for the last 2.5 years. So I'm going to continue to work with Senator Blumenthal to see if we can have a breakthrough on that front. Once we get Hamas and Hezbollah in a box, I think we could have normalization next year, but you got to deal with the Iranian proxies that could upend efforts for peace, and we're dealing with that. So I just want to highlight that yesterday's meeting was stunning when you had the keeper of the Islamic faith, the center of gravity of Islam, Saudi Arabia, sitting in the Oval Office talking about recognizing Israel under certain conditions is something we should all pray and hope happens.
Thank you, sir. Well, energy leverage doesn't necessarily only have to be coercive. There's also sort of a glass half full approach. We've seen several recent announcements on energy commodities that underscore the United States' energy leverage in foreign security, foreign and economic relations. More liquefied natural gas to Europe, including Ukraine. More liquefied petroleum gases, basically propane to India, was just announced. So beyond sanctioning Russia to end the war, will there be bipartisan consensus for American energy to increasingly supply the world? Or do we think that this is an attribute of this moment with a Republican trifecta in Washington?
Well, I think that American energy is going to play a continuing important role in the world, and there's no better place to see how important it has been than Europe, which has weaned itself away from its dependence on Russian oil and gas. One of the great energy success stories, I think, in recent history. They still are dependent a little bit on it, but compared to where they were, the Europeans have really stepped up. They know they were on the front lines. The officials who now run Estonia and Lithuania lived through Russian occupation. They know what it is like to have Russian soldiers in their schools and their churches and their courthouses. They don't want it. And Europe has that residual understanding of what appeasement brings if they don't stand up to it. So they have asserted their energy independence of Russia. They want to work with us, the United States, on sources of energy. So I think we can use our energy as leverage in foreign policy.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where the climate change agenda and national security seemingly collide, but I don't think so. American natural gas going to Europe helps our economy. It weakens Russia's economy, and it gives our European allies an alternative to Putin, Hungary and Slovakia. I am going to be very insistent that we make sure they're trying hard to get off Russian oil and gas, not just keep buying it cheap. So this is a moment where American natural resources, gas is cleaner than coal, can actually change the balance of power. And I think we should go all in creating export terminals. And that's not inconsistent with trying to have a lower carbon economy, I believe. So there's a win-win here. And I hope we take advantage of it. Again, energy wars start over religion, but a lot of times they just start over economics, energy. You know, Russia thinks Ukraine is theirs. You know, that's an ideological mindset. But it's not lost upon me, they also know they have $1 trillion of critical minerals. So there's an economic reason Putin's trying to do this, and we need to defend our interest. As Senator Blumenthal said, once we have this minerals agreement, a third invasion will run right into an American economic interest. But the idea of exporting American natural gas to places that would hurt the bad guys, we should do it.
Thank you, Senator. I knew this was going to happen. I have plenty more questions, but not enough time. This has been a fantastic conversation about an issue right at the nexus of economic security and foreign policy. We hope you will keep us posted on how the initiative progresses. On behalf of CSIS, we're grateful for the senators for taking time to visit with us today and to share their policy insights. Please join me in expressing our appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just one last thought. If we don't deliver, if we don't get this bill out soon, we will have failed. We'll have missed a great opportunity to change the course of this war. To this institute, you studied the effects of this bill. This bill will make a difference if it becomes law. It will give President Trump tools that can change the course of the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war. To my colleagues in the House and the Senate, no is not the right answer when it comes to this bill. Yes is the right answer, and we need to get it done quickly. Thanks.
And the president's support for it, I think, is really a turning point here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you all.
A quick programming note before we exit. I'll invite our in-house audience to please remain seated as we do a quick stage change for the expert panel discussion that's going to begin shortly. For our live stream audience, as they say, stick around. We'll be right back.
this is why you come to CSIS, right? Like, we're talking about energy, we're talking about the biggest questions in geopolitics, we're talking about war and peace. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and thank you to the senators again for not just being here, but for their leadership on this issue. Now we get to talk about, does it actually work? And how should we be thinking about these kinds of policy as they move toward implementation? And I'm joined by a panel here to cover three of the biggest issues I think we need to think about. Maria Stagnovia is a fellow here, or a senior fellow here, excuse me, in our Europe and Russia-Asia program, covers a lot of issues respecting the sort of the status of the Russian economy there and the war. Matt Segers is a market analyst from S&P with a deep history in Russian energy markets and production. And Dhruv Jain Shankar is the vice president or executive director of ORF, and thinks a lot about the Indian economy and its role in the world. So I'm grateful that you're all here. Let's dive right in. Maria, the hypothesis of this approach, right? The senator's bill, the use of energy sanctions to reduce Russian oil revenues. Is it true that the economy is under such strain that if we can reduce these revenues, we can expect the war effort to end, that it creates real pressure on Putin?
Thank you so much for having me. Honored. Yes and no. Unfortunately, of course, right now is the moment to hit, I would argue. Just recently, earlier this year, we published a report together with my colleagues at the Europe-Russian Eurasia team looking at the state of the Russian economy, and we have seen that the original impetus that the economy received as a result of Russia's so-called military Keynesianism, when a lot of money of the state-led investment is put into the economy, into military, industrial defense, and that created the growth in the first 2-3 years of this horrible war. That impetus is gone, and hence our report is actually called From Sugar High to Hangover. So we are in the hangover moment, and this is the moment to hit. But unfortunately, and Russia has shown multiple signs of declining growth, growing inflation, labor shortages, overdependence on Chinese investment, Chinese technology, and erosion of its previous reserves, like the National Welfare Fund. Liquid assets have been declining very dramatically. All of that certainly indicates that the Russian economy is not great. Sanctions are working, and they are cutting down the resources. That's the yes part. Time to hit. The no part, or the question mark part, is that unfortunately there are still limits to how far we can go. First of all, the Russian macroeconomic team is really, really good. Unfortunately, that's something that's historically been the case. They know what we're after, and they're adjusting. They were basically it's a cat-mouse game in which it's very unclear who's winning. And what they've been doing over the last period of last years is actually effectively shrinking the share of the oil and gas revenues in the Russian federal budget from about 50% before the start of the war to 30 or 25% now.
And is that degradation of the revenues coming in because price caps are working, or is it a change in the way they manage their federal budget?
It's all of that, but the changing the way the federal budget is managed is a big part of that. They're just substituting through other sources of revenues, yes, which you can argue taxes. Taxes are also kind of tangentially related to oil, very much related to oil and gas revenues. Yeah. So there's no way really out of that game for them, but the point is that they depend are declining. And the second key point is that every time the Western sanctions hit their oil and gas revenues, the oil revenues plummet. Usually it's oil these days. But over the time, Russia comes a way to rebuild, to create new sanction circumvention scheme. And the shadow fleet in particular, how they do it, and going after shadow fleet is a very complicated endeavor, which may or may not constitute an act of war. So that is the big question: can we really enforce secondary sanctions on Russia?
Right. Matt, let's turn to you just briefly. You study the Russian oil and energy economy as closely as anybody. How, you've written about the sort of rising cost of production. We heard this $35 number from Senator Graham. What's the status of things, and how vulnerable do you think the industry is there to the kind of pressure?
Let me use one word: Teflon. Teflon. As you look at the Russian oil sector at the top, it's just Teflon, or resilient, or use whatever other word you want. It's basically everything has come at it. We've had sanction after sanction, and it's just kind of been shrugged off. Now, I don't want to basically, dismiss the effect of sanctions altogether, because each one of these has acted as a drag. Each one of these have siphoned off, let's say, several billions of dollars with each round and whatnot. That's gone off to middlemen and shadow fleet and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, bounce off, bounce off, bounce off, bounce off. But the question is are we talking about death by 1,000 cuts here? A billion here, a billion here. Pretty soon we're talking real money, as the old Washington saying. But as you look at kind of what's happened to Russian oil just very recently, they've unwound their production along with OPEC Plus. So they've risen by about 400,000 barrels a day since June. They've found markets for all that stuff all around. We can talk a little bit about price and discounts and all that kind of stuff, but sanction after sanction after sanction, and at that very fundamental, it hasn't had much of an impact. I would say that if you look at it, production is up. Now the question is we're going to lift up the skirt a little bit and look underneath in just a second, because on top it's basically Teflon. It's like a turtle shell. Underneath, we might be seeing a few different things, but production's up. The one place that has been very vulnerable has been the refineries. It's been the drone attacks have had some impact. Refinery operation is down. And my view is that this is a very vulnerable spot, and it always has been for a long time. There's only about 30 of them that exist. So if you talk about, I'm going to attack marshaling yards or power stations like that, there's hundreds of them. Right. Refineries, only 30. And out of that 30, there's probably only 10 that really make any difference. You have these big concentrations of very valuable things, a lot of explosive material sitting around that can add to the conflagration. And also, a lot of this stuff is foreign made and can't be readily replaced. On the other hand, we've seen also attacks on ports, and it's like, okay, great, they're out for a couple days, but ports are made out of concrete and steel and very difficult to do any damage, and there's stuff that Russia can fix overall. So, like I said, on the surface, things have looked pretty good. We lift the skirt a little bit, and we see a lot of things happening underneath that give us a little bit of a worry. And so I would say that if you're thinking about these sanctions, the sanctions kill more like a python. They just gradually squeeze you to death rather than like a mamba or a cobra. So underneath we've got, they're moving further and further out the cost curve in terms of the resource base. Costs are going up both because of that, it takes more effort to get out, also because of just general inflation. At the same time, you've got the lack of technology to basically attack that, the Westerners are gone, and at the same time, in your view, we need money. Where are we going to find it? Oil and gas sector is that usual place. So the result is we've seen layered on about $30 billion of additional taxes, and lo and behold, that's about the amount that they've been spending in terms of investment. So at the same time, you need more effort and more activity and so forth. The means to do it is drifting downwards. So underneath, you've got these.
So I hear two things here. I hear, there's like the domestic energy economy, which I think refineries primarily serve.
No, the refineries export 40% of their production goes out as well.
Got it.
And they've had to basically market that stuff all around too. And diesel's pretty easy, everybody wants that, but nobody wants residual fuel oil.
And so that's a sensitive place where kinetic action can be. How much economic pressure can we bring there when we think about not just using sanctions regimes, but all of the tools that the senators are proposing we use, which are additional sanction authority, secondary tariffs, like just severe economic pressure on the buyers?
I think you've got to go after the traders as well, and so you can try and attack that in various sorts of ways. But probably the best method is probably going to be to attack those vulnerable refineries, to basically make it very difficult to operate, and to try and basically change that. I mean, when you look at it, there's 4 refineries around Moscow, 4 that account for 30% of Russia's gasoline and diesel fuel. And, for a long time, what Ukraine was doing was they were doing the cool thing, which was, let's see how far we can go. Let's see how many we can attack. And the answer is, and then they also went after the close ones. And the close ones, the Russians would send them a check if they blew it up. They're so bad. There's a number, we call it a dampening mechanism that basically goes, but there's a number of others that are quite critical, and we're finally getting around to hitting those and hitting those and hitting those. Yeah. It's not like you can knock something out like that. It's a big facility. It's got a lot of redundancy. So there's a number of ways to basically do that.
Dhruva, let's bring you into the conversation. Senator Graham thanked India for its efforts to reduce oil imports from Russia. The U.S. is feeling itself geopolitically. We want to use this energy leverage to try and accomplish goals. How does that read in India, which is a huge buyer of Russian energy?
I think just a little bit of context is required, because I don't think, I should start by saying my caveat is I'm not an energy expert and I'm not a Russia expert, so it's strange to be on this panel.
Perfect. We've got those.
Those are covered. I do follow India-U.S. relations very closely, and this is kind of central to that right now, so obviously this is of interest. But I think a little bit of context is required. So one is, I don't think I get more questions about any other subject in this town than India-Russia relations. And President Putin is going to be making a state visit to India in a couple of weeks in early December. There'll be some big announcements then. There will probably be more questions after that. But I think it's important to distinguish India's strategic relationship with Russia, which has a 50-year history, which is on its trajectory. It's on a certain trajectory, from Russia's point of view, not a positive trajectory necessarily, and then a commodities relationship. And I mentioned this because the commodities relationship, and of which oil and gas, oil especially is a big part of it, is really driven primarily by market forces. It's not driven only by strategic considerations. Prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, less than 3% of India's oil was imported from Russia. It just didn't make sense. It's far away. There are no pipelines between the countries. It's costly. It just didn't make a lot of sense. And what the invasion did is, as Europe especially tried to diversify off of Russian oil and gas, started sourcing more energy from the Middle East, it raised prices of that Middle Eastern oil that India and other Asian countries were very dependent on. So we saw from less than 3% up to as much as 37% of India's oil was coming from Russia. It was also the fifth or sixth. It is about the fifth or sixth largest importer of petroleum products. Countries like Egypt and Turkey are much more, but that's also in the game. And I think what's important to keep in mind is when the Biden administration started imposing those sanctions, it was interesting to think of, I hadn't thought of it as a Python and Mamba analogy, but initially, after February 24th, after the invasion, the idea was like to have a kind of like a slap, right? I mean, it's basically try to get Russia to stop the war as soon as possible. As the months wore on, the sanction strategy shifted. It was quite clear it was becoming a war of attrition. It became more of a Python strategy, right? And as part of that, the Biden administration actually encouraged India to try and buy Russian oil because it would help keep global prices down. There were inflationary pressures here at home in the United States and in Europe. And so that was part of a kind of informal arrangement that came up at that time. And so in some ways, we're living still with the consequences of all of that. Now, what's happening now? I think the big change, even before we talk about further legislation, is that a tapering effect is already taking place. I think the high point was in April, where India bought about 2 billion barrels a day from Russia. But now with the impending sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, which kick in November 21st, I believe, we're already starting to see India's major importers dropping quite significantly. And I think this is what the senator was referring to. So we were about 1 billion in barrels a day, 1 million barrels a day in September. It has gone up a little bit. It is now probably going to...
Can I interject here? Yeah. We've seen this same pattern in the past, so it's not like it's new. Right. When the new sanctions come out, this is the thing about sanctions, they're a wasting asset. You have to keep changing the game over time to keep everybody on their toes. But we've seen that when the sanctions come out, we get this pause, this pullback. And then what happens is you find workarounds. You basically sell it to your brother-in-law sells it to his brother-in-law, it comes around. And then what happens is it comes back each and every time. So we're looking at India, they're now seeing, the October round is basically hitting them. And I don't want to be, belittle anything, but I'm just wondering whether we're going to see another drawback, pause, and then push forward.
And maybe because I think, as I mentioned at the outset, this is all driven primarily by markets. It's not a strategic play. One other aspect of it, there is a conscious attempt at trying to diversify away from Russia. And not just because it's Russia, but just diversify in general. I think it's so we are seeing an uptake of Indian oil and gas purchases from the United States. On Monday, there was a LPG deal signed for about 10% of India's imports from the United States. It's sort of the first deal of its kind. There's also been a new high in Indian oil imports, about $8.3 billion in the first 8 to 10 months of this year of Indian oil imports, crude oil imports from the United States. So there has been an uptake. I think the White House has noticed that. President Trump himself has said something about that. So again, we are in this sort of churn.
That brings us to a big picture question, right? Which is, how do you kind of fight market? Fighting market forces is really hard, and the oil market in particular is quite fluid. It's complicated. There's trading that occurs all over the world. It's hard to track cargoes. They can move on ships, or they can move between ships. Part of what I see in the conversation in Washington now is an attempt to move away from sort of more technical approaches and toward sort of more brute force approaches, right? Buy Russian oil, face large tariffs. Buy Russian oil, face other economic pressures. We're not just kind of dealing with the receipts on cargoes anymore. Is that going to be a method that works, Matt?
My opinion, no. Again, I'll use my word Teflon, which is where there's a will, there's a way. When we've seen this before, they'll find it'll cost them a few $billion, but it'll keep going. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when I think about what Russia's aiming at, it's a political principle, and therefore a lot of these economic routes and so forth that we're expecting just kind of don't have the same drag would be the word. So we saw blocking sanctions against the two other Russian companies in January. Wow, okay. Had a short little pause. We just had it again for the two larger ones. The pause is now on. The question is it going to come back?
Yeah, please, Maria.
Go ahead.
If I can chip in, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the thinking about the oil sanctions is changing. The original Biden administration sanctions were designed to keep Russia's oil on the market because there was not enough oil supply in the world, and the fear was that it will increase prices and eventually converting into inflation, which will hit politically, which it actually did regardless. Right now, the thinking is different. We have a little bit more leeway now because there is more supply of oil on the markets, and so there's actually flexibility to reconsider. But I just want to say that Russian oil is on the markets by design. That's how we intended it. Now we're not happy about it because it's not delivering the way we want it to. But it's actually how we designed it. So I actually think it empowers us a little bit. Second,
she's exactly right. The goal was to basically suck the money off the top. This is the money that goes into the budget that basically funds the war machine. We basically leave the oil in the market, but we step off the cream. It was a process to be managed, I guess, rather than.
Okay. Now we're changing the attitude, and maybe we will be able to shrink a little bit of the oil available on the markets. But by now, Russia's adjusted. It has invested all this extra effort in the infrastructure of sanctions circumvention, the shuttle fleet, and now it's much harder to do. But I just want to flag that it was intentional. Second, most likely there is no perfect silver bullet that solves all our issues, but there is a possibility, together with the strikes against refineries, all these other efforts going on to create multiple bottlenecks that will eventually deliver. We do see that Russian economy is Russia's already in this stagflation cycle. At the very least, the civil production has been declining in recession probably already for a year. So from that perspective, if there is a targeted pressure on all these various areas combined with Ukrainian strikes, there will be an exhaustion, but it will take time. And I will also want to flag that, unfortunately, as horrible as it is, the war is relatively cheap for Russia, in terms of tangible material cost of it. So unfortunately, this can last for a while, and we should brace ourselves. There's not going to be easy solutions.
Can these secondary sanctions on the buyers be a breakthrough? Is the big question right now?
I think that's it. That is, and either in effect or in the belief of Russian leadership.
I mean, that's up to President Putin. I mean, you'd have to ask the Kremlin that. But I think, I see a sort of series of 4 interlocking problems, potentially. One is, it really depends how the legislation is drafted and worded. I can see that the logic is to give the White House, give the presidency tools, the maximum potential tools. However, if it's worded in a way that is deemed unfeasible and unrealistic, 500% tariffs on anyone who does any kind of commerce. I know that's just a maximalist. That's the way legislation is drafted in this town, but I think it'll come across to a lot of other people as just unrealistic. And really, it'll be up to, then you negotiate with the White House and you can sort of get waivers and a whole bunch of things, right? So I think a lot of thought needs to go into, is this something that is feasible and enforceable, and will others really believe, is it credible, right? So that's the first. The second problem is, I think for a lot of countries, India included, but I think a lot of countries in the global south, the fact is they're much more price sensitive than developed economies, right? When you're in India, you have $3,000 per capita incomes. Slight changes in energy prices have huge. They're either going to impact you, or it's going to impact the fiscal deficit, which is going to, or inflation, right? So, the appetite for a lot of countries to take on risk in their energy, in their global energy supply is going to be higher, right? So if it requires a stare down with the White House on an issue like this, many countries will be willing to do that. So that gets, again, to the enforceability question. The third is, we're dealing with a lot of diversified conglomerates. So there are companies that are engaged in the various parts of the oil trade globally that also have stakes in many other areas. So the ripple effects could be somewhat unintended. And I think that gets to another point, which is, it could, in some ways, if you actually enforce these sanctions, hurt U.S. exporters in other areas as well, right? I mean, I followed the defense markets, for example, and if the U.S. says we're sanctioning this country for its energy imports, but we're also trying to sell you stuff, but whether it's defense, critical minerals, whatever it is, that you're going to run into those kinds of problems. So I just think sometimes in the zeal to focus on this one potential pain point for Russia, the longer-term ripple effects, including the rebound, the boomerang effect for U.S. exporters, is not being fully considered. And it gets, again, I think, to the larger problem, which is a longer-term problem, which is just there's even now insufficient global supply. If there's sanctions on Russia, on Iran, on Venezuela, Saudi Arabia is not dramatically increasing its output. The United States has constraints on its side. Canada is not doing as much as it should be. So the places where we should be getting a lot more energy from globally are not still where they could be.
Yeah, we never really set a long-term plan for saying, okay, how do we get Russian barrels out of the global economy? Like, we need to maybe focus on the supply side as well. If we're going to try and make geopolitical changes to the system over here, but let this be driven by market forces, we might be missing a part of the equation. Matt, what are your thoughts on this question of the global supply issue? And then secondly, I did see you respond when Senator Graham brought up Hungary and Slovakia and getting them off Russian gas. Pipelines are much easier to control than seaborne shipping. If you could touch on those two issues, and then I think we can turn to the room if you guys got a couple minutes to see if there's anything we missed.
Well, myself, if Russia can't sell to its 3 chosen people, China, India, and Turkey, those 3 account for 80% of their exports. The rest of the stuff just doesn't matter. It's just little niggly-piggly here and there. So one of the places that Europe is now trying to remove the appetite for Russian oil is to basically sanction and ban the re-imports of derived products to come in. And when you look at that, China, it doesn't matter at all. They send almost nothing in terms of products to Europe. India's kind of in between, and it's from refinery to refinery. But Turkey is huge. 60% of their refined product exports go to Europe. So for them, it's going to be a major change if this sanction on imports come out. So you've got a lot of different things. And I think one of the things that comes very clear from our senator talk this morning is, let's not leave any stone untouched. Let's touch them all. Let's see what works. And it's kind of my Python analogy. Let's see if you can just kind of gradually wind them down. there's unlikely to be a single magic bullet here in this whole mix. The other thing is that one of the things we got to be very concerned about is if they can't sell to these countries, then it's just simply going to stay on the ground. And that's going to be Russian oil that's not in the market, and that will have an inevitable price knock-on effect. And so the question is that 1 million barrels a day? Is that 2 million barrels a day? If it's one, there's enough slosh around. Two, I start to get...
One in the first year, two in the second year, three in the third year.
I get
going to five.
And I get very worried. And at the same time, of course, we're in a situation where global oil demand is not exactly very robust and growing and all that kind of stuff. So...
Well, that actually gives us room, doesn't it?
It could actually give us room, but again,
I'm looking to strand some assets here.
You want to bet the farm on this one or not? It's a hard one.
Yeah, totally. Maria, can you touch briefly on the China question, which we did hear from the senators, and then folks have questions. We have time to take two from the room.
Yeah, absolutely. China is one of the key, absolutely crucial factors that allow Russia to sustain this war. Just some stats: 76% of Russia's battlefield imports and 90% of restricted tech comes from China or Hong Kong. Now, we just published a report also about the brief looking at the economic collaboration between Russia and China. Russia has no choice other than increasing its reliance on China economically. But the good news, China is responsive to the Western sanctions somewhat, and it also not eager to equally over-rely its economic prospects on Russia. Specifically, China, for example, diversifies its oil suppliers. Despite the availability of cheap oil coming from Russia, China still actively imports from Iran, Saudi, you name it. Second, for example, China is not eager to invest in other projects that would have helped Russia, like Power of Siberia 2. There's some use that they may have agreed about the price, but it was coming from Russia. Most likely, it's another PR.
Do you think they got a good deal?
They are going to get a really good deal.
China is, not Russia. So altogether, there's a lot of opportunistic element to economic angle of the relationship between the two countries. Right. Most recently, this Lukoil Rosneft sanctions did hit partly because China decreased purchase of Russia's crude, and as a result, Russia's Urals is right now as a 2.5 years low, $36 and $6, I think, per barrel. So from that, I think there's a leeway from that perspective, even if in the long term, don't be mistaken, there is a lot of, at least in the security realm, there's a lot of alignment, deepening alignment between Russia and China.
Excellent, thank you. Ben, you've got a question, and then let's hear it.
Is the microphone on?
Yes, sir.
Ben Cahill, I'm at the University of Texas and a non-resident program affiliate here. My question is on the eventual removal of sanctions. So I think we've found over the last decade that it's easy to add sanctions, but once they're in place, they don't tend to get removed. Instead, workarounds tend to happen. Do you think that there's a problem there in that a leader like Putin doesn't see the win in, following the path that U.S. policymakers hope? Is there a prospect that some of these sanctions, secondary tariffs, secondary sanctions will be removed if he changes course in Ukraine?
Welcome your thoughts on that.
Domestically, it's yes and no. Like Putin, I think it's important to realize that our leverage over Putin and the number of carrots we can offer to Putin is very limited. Both Biden administration, Trump administration very actively engaged with Russia. If you remember pre-2022 diplomatic effort of the Biden administration to outreach to Russians to offer them all sorts of carrots. They did not deliver, and we just have seen President Trump administration pretty much end up in the same situation. So it's not that Putin is not credible, not trusting that sanctions cannot be relieved. It's just that he's not really interested as much in them being relieved before he achieves his goals in Ukraine, addresses so-called regional causes of this war. And also do not forget that Russia is undergoing its own changes. The war has created a lot of beneficiaries. Look at all these people who now own the formerly Western assets. They're not eager to give them back, if there's some sort of settlement taking place. And from that perspective, a lot of people in Russia are the new stakeholders of this new status quo. They are the ones who actually actively lobby against sanctions lift. Also, for example, the protecting domestic businesses. They would not have been competitive with the Western businesses otherwise. So I think this actually creates a much more complicated dynamic. The Kremlin is just not very interested in what we get to offer.
If I may, I think also, President Trump is the ultimate deal maker. I don't think he would have any qualms about removing sanctions. But if I'm Putin, I'm fighting a 1,000-year war, And I have to deal with a presidential election, which is already starting to begin, and who knows what the next person will think. And that's why I think these sort of bipartisan efforts, like we saw from the senators today, are really the only thing that give U.S. negotiators a lot of credibility about the maintenance of a policy or a strategy program going forward. Clay, you have a question, and then...
Hey, thanks to all the panelists for the insights. We'll get granular on oil logistics for just a second, maybe with Matt. So I agree completely. There's the risk off phase when the sanctions hit, and then there's usually a reversion back to status quo ante a couple of 3 months thereafter. Right now, though, it seems like there could be the potential for a physical crunch in Russia with regard to storage. And so there's some distressed barrels there. They've got limited storage space within the Transneft network. Do you think that we could face production shut-ins? If we stay around, $30 for Urals?
My guess is yes. They have virtually no storage. It's only operational. We have heard tales of basically barrels backing up at sea as well. In other words, they've been produced, they've been dispatched, and they can't find a home. So the question is are this October round, let's call it that, are these things going to basically change enough on the margin for the appetites for this stuff to basically do that? Because ultimately the only way that Russia can equilibrate this is they have to cut production. And they would really they love the pause from OPEC Plus because they didn't have to put their cards on the table. I've been expecting that we would find that the emperor has no clothes, although they've raised production by 400,000 barrels a day with the unwinding and their compensation deals. And as if it went on, they would have had to basically demonstrate, do we have anything in the bin or do we not? And I think that they don't is my thing. I think that they've done what they've done. So therefore, we could easily see some kind of production cuts that wouldn't be OPEC delivered or mandated, that could come from just simply the aggregate activity of these buyers.
Just to add the context to my question, why I asked, shut-ins are important not only for the global supply, but also for the Kremlin's take, because the Kremlin receives its revenues to fight the war and everything else at the wellhead, at the point of production. If you have a production shut-in and there's fewer volumes being produced, then you get to your potential crunch, right?
And then you also have to massage the market. What story are you telling about what's happening? So the story that they've been telling before is that we are, absolutely OPEC plus in terms of our coloration. We are going right down where we're going to be 50,000 barrels a day lower. We are being the perfect citizens here and so forth. If production was going to have to continue to be rise, then they would have a problem. At the same time, there's no OPEC cuts that they can hide behind if they have to reduce production.
Excellent. Thank you all for the session. Before we close, 3 sentences. I've heard from this session, this is a process. It's complicated. It's long. We have an impatient president, and we have an ongoing war, which I think we generally agree needs to stop. And so, very briefly, one thing you're watching or one thing policymakers need to seize on immediately. Maria, go.
I guess how quickly, exactly as we discussed, the oil profits of Russia will bounce back based on this current reality. We're also looking at the Russian macroeconomic team hiding Russian economic data, because the moment they start hiding it, especially when it comes to economic growth, things are not so great for them. And of course, Ukraine's strikes against refineries have been incredibly successful, credit where credit is due. So we certainly will keep watching how quickly Russians can repair those, if at all.
Excellent. Well done, Matt.
Those are the 3 things that I was going to talk about as well. Is this a pause, or is this a real change in appetite among the buyers? Is there a continuous hammering on this Russian infrastructure that's going to have a long-term benefit or not? Those are the 2 things that I'm really watching very closely.
Excellent. Dhruva.
I think 2 things. One is, again, coming back to the long-term consequences of this, we have a longer-term energy transition underway. I feel things are being taken off the table rather than being put on the table. So I think there's a longer term problem far beyond this that I'm concerned about. And secondly, the unintended consequences of this. Whatever the intent might be and the focus might be on Russia in the short term, I do think there are a lot of potential unintended consequences, even well beyond the energy sector, that are not necessarily being fully thought through.
Hear, hear. All right, thank you all. Would you, with your warm applause, thank our panelists? This was an enlightening conversation. One of the hardest things to do is follow senators of that stature. You all did a wonderful job. Colleagues, thank you for joining us today. Colleagues who joined us online, thank you so much. This is Joseph Mikan for CSIS, signing off.